Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Dear Jane. I'm your co host, Marcy Little. I'm joined by Scott Baker. Scott, how's it going?
Going well. How are you doing, Marcy?
Great. I'm very excited about today's conversation and excited about today's sponsor, Scott. There is a pro life political campaign messaging group that, if there are pro life groups in America hoping to win pro life battles this year, need to know about. Can you please tell us about Cogency Strategic?
Yep. Shout out to our sponsor, Cogency. So here's the deal. A lot of states are going to be facing constitutional battles this year. Let's cut to the chase. Our movement needs to get its act together. We've lost all the battles we've had so far. It's because we're not messaging correctly, we're not saying the right things, and we're not delivering it the right ways. The other side is sophisticated, and Cogency can help you deliver the correct message in the right ways. So you need to check them out, cogentsystrategic.com. They can help you win your pro-life campaign.
Awesome. Definitely check them out. They are already engaged in a lot of campaign work, and it's exciting to see the results of those campaigns. So check them out. We're shifting now to begin our conversation today. We are joined by Joyce McCauley-Benner. Thanks for joining us today. Joyce is a pro-life feminist. She works with Feminists for Life and has just been an advocate for over 20 years now for people, vulnerable populations, so women and others who are victims of the sex trafficking industry, women who have been exploited by the abortion industry, low-income populations. You've done a lot of really great work to help these people and to help propel the mission of Feminists for Life. So can you start today? I know you've shared your story on a lot of different platforms. Can you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and kind of what got you into this work?
Sure, and thanks for having me on. I was introduced to Feminists for Life back in 2006, roughly. Um, but I didn't know that at that time, I had no idea that there was pro-life feminism out there. I was kind of a closeted pro-life feminist because I didn't know that you could be pro-life and still be a feminist. So one day, my friend sent me an email. We were looking to, um, you know, spread that message, and I found Feminists for Life. And at the time, they had sent out a message asking if anyone had any sort of dynamic pregnancy stories. And at the time, I didn't think that my story was that interesting or dynamic or different. It was just my story, right? But I had never really told anybody outside of my very close friends and family like what had happened. And so I decided to, I don't know what made me write it up that day, but I did. And I sent it off to Feminists for Life. And immediately I was nervous. I was like, oh my gosh, should I have really done that? But within a few weeks, they contacted me and I met Sarah Foster, our president. And she really kind of helped me tell the story in an empowering way. So for those that don't know, while I was working my way through college, I worked two jobs and I used financial aid to support myself. I had moved about 1,000 miles away from home, so I was completely on my own. And one night I was working in a restaurant, and one night I was a waitress, and the cook started to show some advances towards me. And he also started making like my dishes come out faster and better, so I was getting better tips, and he started to make advances on me. I told him I wasn't interested. I was in another relationship at the time. I had never paid attention to this cook before. I honestly didn't really know him or remember him. And it escalated throughout the night. At one point, he had pushed me inside a cooler and made sexual advances towards me. And as the night went on, later that night, he would rape me. And so I kind of didn't know what to do. And after several weeks, I wasn't feeling very well, and I discovered that I was pregnant. So at that time, I didn't know if the pregnancy was a result of the rape or my relationship at the time. And so that was a very difficult journey to navigate. But some of the ways that I did that was I called home, obviously, and I talked to some of my closest friends. And I had a friend who said to me, Joyce, I know you're going through a lot of emotions right now. And I just want you to remember no one feeling lasts forever. An abortion will. And it was that kind of statement that I was like, needed help in processing, because that's a factual statement.
Mm.
And sometimes when we're going through trauma, it's hard for us to kind of process the logic, right? And so it wasn't that she was like forcing me into any decision. It was just she was helping me to think through that. And upon deeper reflection, like I started to dig really deep and trying to decide what to do. I realized that regardless of who the father was, this child was mine. We did not know who the father was, but we did know who his mother was. And that was me. And, there was as much of me inside this child as there was the rapist. And that's when I was like, this is it. This is my child. And was it unplanned? Of course. And was it difficult? Of course. But he was my child. And so that kind of gave me the strength to go home. I did return home to have my baby boy. And so, in a nutshell, that's kind of the story that I share with Feminists for Life. I have a speech called Victory Over Violence where I kind of go into more detail and share some of that and share some of those messages. I think so often in our society, we're still saying language like the rapist baby, and that's really demeaning towards women. And it really says, why in 2024 does the paternity of the child still matter more than his mother, especially in cases of violence. So that's something that I'm still trying to get out there. So I
Joyce,
shared that. Oh, yep. Go ahead.
no, I'm sorry. No, please. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, so I shared that story with Feminists for Life, and like I said, Saren kind of helped me, and that was the beginning of my journey. I started speaking for Feminists for Life, and along the way, I was still doing other jobs, helping other women. And I became a legal advocate and a case manager for victims involved in sex trafficking, both juveniles and adults. Learned a lot through that. And so eventually I would also do a speech called Slaves Among Us, in which I kind of educate the audience about what is sex trafficking, what does it look like on the domestic side. And sometimes it's completely different than what you might imagine or what Hollywood might portray. So that was kind of the journey into where I am today, into this movement.
So I jumped the gun because I'm going to ask you a question I've always wanted to ask. But first, thank you for sharing your story. That can't be easy. That shows tremendous courage. That extraordinary courage. Number one, and it's the stories like that are necessary if we're ever going to change hearts and minds about abortion. So thank you for that. So a personal confession for me, I've been pro-life for years and years and years. And every time, you get into some sort of a conversation or debate, eventually it's going to get around, the other side's going to talk about rape and incest, right?
Yeah.
It gets around to that eventually. And so when it gets around to that, when I'm in that conversation and if it gets around to them saying, well, what about in the case of rape, the mother, and the pain that she'll go through carrying that baby for 9 months. Why put her through that? And Joyce, it's at that point where I'm like, I got nothing. I got nothing. What help me there? Help me. I don't know if you want to if you can give me words. You help walk me through that a little bit.
Right. And so the first thing to acknowledge that is, of course, we always want to acknowledge rape is horrible. Rape is the crime, right? And the woman is not at fault for anything that happened. And there's all different kinds of stories out there of women surviving rape. And I had a couple thoughts on that. One definitely is, I think, I know for me, shifting my mindset to this was unplanned. Of course, did I plan to be pregnant? Of course not. Was that a surprise and a challenge? Yes. But can I dig deep? I'm a survivor of rape, which means I'm pretty strong, which means I can also survive an unplanned pregnancy. I think sometimes we make the pregnancy the bigger trauma than the rape. Now, is the pregnancy or an abortion going to take away the pain of rape? No. An abortion is not going to take away the pain of rape. All it's going to do is remove the child that was created. And again, there is as much of me, there's as much of that mother inside that child. And I think there's a lot, people do cling to this idea in cases of rape where, well, the child is somehow only the rapist child. And so therefore it'll be I don't know, defective child. I don't know what our fear is. And we forget that children are their own independent beings, right? My son is not a carbon copy of me or the biological father. He's just not. He's his own being. And so adding on that secondary trauma of abortion, especially depending how far along you are and what type of an abortion you get, that can be equally triggering to the woman. I had a hard time going in just for checkups, right? Like prenatal checkups. I can't imagine going into an abortion clinic and going through a procedure that is inherently invasive, right? So for me, it's that when people respond that way, what they really want to do is take away the pain of the rape. I think ultimately that's where their heart is coming from for the most part. But the problem is abortion's not going to do that. What's
Because
done
a lot
is
of
done.
time, men are told to sit this one out, sit this whole
Right.
conversation out, as you know. And of course, obviously, I disagree with that. But on this specific area, I don't know. I mean, because one time I got in a conversation, they said, well, that kid's going to be a daily reminder during the pregnancy. And then after they're born, a daily reminder of the trauma of the rape. And I don't know any better as a man. I don't know any better.
Yeah.
So what's your response to that?
First of all, again, going back to children are their independent selves, right? Like, first of all, the child could look like the mom, number one. There's no guarantee that this child that comes out, whether it's a boy or a girl, is like this carbon copy of the parents. And he or she will grow into him or herself. Definitely, I think this is where nurture versus nature also comes in too. For me, I chose single parenthood. So I did raise my son, and he was just himself. I didn't look at him. There were, triggers are a real thing. So I don't want to, say that they're not. But at least for me and for many, many women that I've talked to, the triggers are not in the child. The triggers can be other places, maybe that are reminders, anniversary dates. So when you come around to like the date the event happened, like those kinds of things can be triggers. But the child usually is not. And in severe cases of trauma, when there's severe cases of rape, maybe a very brutal, something very severe, maybe we're not advocating for parenthood, right? Maybe we're advocating for adoption. Maybe we're advocating that the mother might not be in a position to parent. But that doesn't mean the child needs to die. It just means that maybe the child needs to be placed with parents who can care for the child. But children are themselves. He developed his own personality that was independent from me. And when I look at him, I just see my beautiful son. And I think we have to remind women again, like, let's stop clinging to this very old idea that you are the paternity matters. And even ask us, are you exactly like your dad? Like, I'm not. I'm sure you're not. We might have some traits, but they become their own selves.
That's such a helpful way to think about it. I think you bring up so many good points. And I think a lot of times we've talked about this a lot on the show. I think a lot of times people get stuck in this place of where they feel like they're advocating something that's compassionate, but they're advocating for something that they haven't really thought through. They haven't carried it to the logical conclusion. And so
Right.
I think you bring up a lot of really great points. Like, what makes us think that this child is going to only take on the character and attributes of the father when they're like partially mine too? But it makes me think of, I think the people that have perpetuated this the most, and then obviously it trickles down to culture, is people within like the big abortion industry. And it feels
Mhm.
very much like exploitation. It feels predatory,
Mhm.
um, to say, no, the only solution to an
Right.
unplanned pregnancy as a result of rape is abortion. Can you speak some to that exploitation by the abortion industry and how that's connected to women who are rape victims?
Right. I think it's a very black and white thing, black and white thinking. It's like, okay, well, let's take one severe situation over here, and then let's just assume that that's every single situation. I think it's also disempowering, right? So it again says, okay, you're a victim of rape. You will never persevere. You'll never be able to do this. So let me just take care of this for you. And along the way, we're going to make money off of that, right? And so it's coming from a place of this is just too terrible for you. And again, I want to separate and distinct. Yes, the rape is terrible. Absolutely. Full stop. But to say that we can't persevere and that the worst outcome of the rape is a child, I think is where we need to take a look at that. And what is their motivation? So when we're looking at people being exploited, we have to say, well, what is your motivation? Meaning, in this case, the abortion industry. Well, obviously, their motivation is to get more abortions and to make more money. And so I think they're taking a situation where a woman may not see the strength within herself at the time, especially if she doesn't have people surrounded by her who are telling her she's strong enough. And she may, fall prey to that and make that choice, and they're benefiting off of that because now she's got two traumas to grieve. She'll
Hmm.
always have the rape that she has to grieve and process. We can't take that away. It's already happened. But now she'll have, you can't erase the pregnancy. You can't unpregnant yourself and say, oh, I never got pregnant, so I never have to like process this. You're going to have to process it. And along the way, who benefited? So I would argue the only beneficiary was the abortion industry. So it's really frustrating. And then they don't acknowledge that there are women out there who have been raped, who have become pregnant, who have parented and have gone on to flourish. And what about those women? Right? Like they do exist. We do exist. Life does go on and we are strong enough and our children are worth the same. We don't line people up and say, well, how were you conceived? Like there are children out there that were conceived in a one night stand. There are children that are conceived in a happy marriage. We don't do that in society. It shouldn't matter how you were conceived. So you can persevere through this. And I just continue to say the rape was worse than a child being born. Like, this is not the tragedy we can't overcome. We can overcome that. It's not a tragedy.
You talk about women being strong, and you made the observation early on that you didn't think that you could be a feminist and pro-life at the same time, which makes sense to me because you just think about political. There's not a whole lot of political overlap, things like that.
Right.
But it seems to me the whole premise of big abortion is making the case that women are not strong enough to do all the above. You can't have a baby and a career, or you
Hmm.
can't do this, or you can't do that. My mom was the strongest human being on the planet, as far as I'm concerned. She was an unbelievably strong woman. So it would seem to me that that feminism and pro life are hand in glove.
Right. Well, and it was Feminists for Life who introduced me to pro-life feminism and the early American feminists. The same women who argued for women to get the right to vote, also were pro-life. And I didn't know that research. Nobody taught me that growing up. I didn't know or read Elizabeth Cady Stanton and what she had to say about that. And so, and even Alice Paul has a quote. She says, "Abortion is the ultimate in the exploitation of women." And that's a quote by Alice Paul, who also authored the original Equal Rights Amendment. So there's a lot of like really incredible women out there that are feminists that stick to that very pro-life stance. And once I learned that and was introduced to that by Feminists for Life, I was like, wow, and that really encouraged me and kept me going and saying, yes, we can do this. And yeah, I don't understand this concept. And we're also there's a fear, it's almost like there's a fear of children on the abortion industry side, that like, oh, if you have the baby while you're going to school, you don't want to deal with that. It's like, well, why not? What could happen? So it is very much a disempowering way, and they just continue to say, we'll help you fix it. And again, I argue that that comes from, their bottom line and what they're looking to advance and what they're looking to do. They're not in the business of empowering women. And they've unfortunately been able to spread that message, though, that somehow abortion is turned into, for traditional feminism, and second wave feminism, it's, oh, well, this is somehow empowering for you if you have the right to abort. And that's just crazy to me. There's so many other ways that, as a feminist, I believe we can empower women. Like, why would doing something to my body and the child that, again, I share DNA with, and destroying that and hurting my body and taking my money, how is that empowering?
Yeah. And instead, you get the opportunity to teach your child resiliency, which is
Mm-hmm.
something huge that's missing today. You get to show what a strong woman looks like and be a role model. Yeah. I love how inspiring your story is. And I think this gives people a lot to think about. I want to shift gears just a tiny bit, still talking about abortion, but you've done a lot of work with sex trafficking
Mm-hmm.
victims too. Can you talk to us about the connection between those two industries and how the abortion industry and exploitation of women on that end actually like helps accelerate the sex trafficking industry?
Yes. So, with sex trafficking domestically, I worked mostly with teens, minors, but they're also adults as well. And depending what style of trafficking, because depending on the region of the United States that we're talking about, there are different styles as well as different kinds of traffickers out there. So in my speech, I kind of go more in depth into explaining all of them, but I'll kind of just give you the big two. So there's a what we call a finesse style pimp or trafficker. I'm going to interchangeably use those words, but today we usually say trafficker. A finesse style is somebody who, lures, and again, I'm going to traditionally say girl. Boys can be exploited as well, but since our conversation today, we're going to focus on girls. Um, a finesse style is psychological manipulation is their main tool. So they're not necessarily kidnapping, grabbing girls off the street. This is where we're seeking out girls who ultimately are probably coming from backgrounds of prior abuse and neglect. And we know that over 80% of sex trafficking victims have childhood abuse and neglect histories in their background. So these are already women and girls who have had that kind of trauma and may have had some maladaptive techniques that they've used to survive. So they're already kind of, in a hard spot. They find somebody who loves them or who they think loves them. They get lured into the ring. Once they're in the ring and once they're actually working, um, most traffickers do not want their girls to become pregnant from a John or a customer, for lots of reasons. One, it disrupts their ability to use the girl to, continue to make money, and exploit her. And so they usually would go for an abortion. Now, that said, um, most of the times they would probably try to do the abortion early on if they knew about it, if they knew the girl was pregnant. So when I was working, the chemical abortion pills or medication abortion wasn't yet as popular as it is today. But still, they're also going to use the other girls in the ring to take that girl who's pregnant to an abortion clinic. So I think there's a lot of um, what I want to say, stereotypes where a trafficker will drop off the girl. He's probably not going to do that. In the more traditional sense, they're going to have another girl who's in the ring pose as a mom, an aunt, a friend, whatever, bring her in. And so, but what does that do for her? Nobody's asking questions. And why do they go for an abortions? They go for abortions because they know at abortion clinics, nobody's asking questions,
Hmm.
right? We know this as pro-lifers. We know they're not digging deep and asking questions and saying, how old are you? Or asking those warning signs like, has anybody pressured you into having sex even? Like, we're not even asking those questions. And so they're choosing abortion because they know the abortion industry will be complicit in the secrecy, right? And then the abortion will happen, no questions asked. They'll just be like, okay, you're here with your friend, whatever. And even if she comes back, I don't know, a couple months later, nobody's asking questions again, right? Why are you back so soon? Like, and so this allows the girl to be put right back into the ring and to be used over and over again, right? And so that's where that is happening. I'm a little more nervous now with the availability of medication abortion or chemical abortion pills, because they're more likely to get those and then the girls would be having self-managed abortions, which are very unsafe, given also the fact that they're already living unsafe lives, right? And they could have all kinds of issues wrong with them. And so to also on top of that be doing self-managed abortions just makes me really worried for the women and girls. But that said, there are also rings that do use birth control and try hard not to deal with this, because it is to them a nuisance, right? Because again, the point is they're trying to keep those girls on the street and not get them pregnant. But it does definitely allow them to continue to put the girls on the street. And with nobody asking questions, the girl continues that. You can read some stories of girls who, had 6 abortions in 2 years.
Yes.
So I know that our sidewalk counselors are able to we're starting to train sidewalk counselors to really look for these signs, because it's really interesting that people who might pray outside of a clinic or people who might do sidewalk counseling are the ones picking up on, wait a minute, that woman has come with 3 different girls in the same van or car, that's a red flag. That might not be just a traditional family, right? And so that's important to interrupt that and to say, maybe there's something big going on.
You know who opened my eyes to this relatively recently, within the last year or so, is Jean Marie Davis. I don't know if you know her, but she lives up in Delaware, Vermont. I don't know. They're all the same, but just kidding, folks up there. I'm just kidding. I'm just playing. But she was talking about up there in the New England area just how bad human trafficking is. And that really opened my eyes, because I would think of it as, okay, yes, maybe in other countries, or maybe, Florida, Southern border states, that sort of thing. No, 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 no. It is everywhere. It is prevalent. Do not fall into the trap of thinking it's not in my area, right? I mean,
Right.
it is much more prevalent than people realize.
Right. And it's happening in all kinds of places. It can happen in a sleazy motel that maybe you've driven by, in the bad part of town, so to speak, and you just forget about it, right? It can be in the back of strip clubs. It can be definitely online, which is, probably one of the most dominating forces today. It could be anywhere. It could be in somebody's house, who just paid for that person to be dropped off there. So I think that's why people forget that it can happen, or not realize that it can happen everywhere, is that it's not always in places that you might think, like those large tourism areas, although it is happening there as well. But yeah, it's happening everywhere, in everyone's backyard, no matter if we're talking about New England, the Midwest, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And I think that's something that we really have to wrestle with, is what's going on with how we commodify women's bodies and children's bodies, to the point where this is like one of the number one issues.
It makes me think of the different states that are going to have abortion amendment battles coming up. So I live in Colorado, where abortion is already legal through all 9 months of pregnancy, but we have groups trying to bring an abortion amendment. And one of the characteristics of these, it seems like, is They want unrestricted abortion. They don't want any type of restriction. But what that turns into is unregulated abortion. And
Right.
I usually think about that from like a health and safety standpoint of
Hmm.
like clinic conditions, no health and safety checks by the local health department. But it makes me think it's it's going to be unregulated in the sense that you were talking about too, that nobody's paying attention to the same woman bringing multiple girls in, or any of those kind of warning signs, and that it points to the really insidious nature of the abortion industry too, that they
Hmm.
don't want any restrictions because it's going to infringe upon
Right.
this other industry as well.
Right. And it's not protecting women and children. I mean, if
Mm-hmm.
one of the survivors that taught me and was training me when I was becoming a case manager for sex trafficking victims, she herself was a victim herself as a child. It started with incest. Because again,
Mm-hmm.
80% of the women that get involved in trafficking have a prior childhood abuse. And so, as she was 9 and 11 when the incest was happening, she looked a little bit older than those ages, but those were her ages. And she became pregnant as a result of the incest. And her mother took her to an abortion clinic. That young of a child, nobody asked questions. And so the abortion happened, and she was sent right back home, only to come
Mm-hmm.
back, 2 years later, pregnant again from the same abuser. And so, again, I challenge the other side. If you are pro woman and, pro child, then why wouldn't you want those regulations in place? Right? Like, why wouldn't you want to
Mm-hmm.
screen for domestic violence, screen for coercion, screen for sex trafficking? And every time, those kinds of things are brought up, it's like, no, you have to have unrestricted abortion. And and so that makes me wonder again, whose benefit is this? It's definitely not the women's.
Mm-hmm. You've given us some warning signs that would be obvious at an abortion clinic. What about elsewhere at a gas station or rest stop or out in the world? What are some other warning signs that something bad might be going on?
So it can be hard if you don't know the person, but in general, we talk about just things that make give you pause. So for example, things that don't make sense. I once was working with a girl and she had unexplained injuries on her, bruising all down her legs. And so I asked her, I was like, "Oh my gosh, what happened?" And she said that she was trying to open the window and it was broken and it fell out and she fell out. And that just, how you're just like, "Wait, what?"
Mm, yeah.
It didn't quite fit. That's something that you kind of put in the back of your mind, like, I don't know, that doesn't seem right. Um, Older school things are like tattoos for sure, especially on people that are under 18. So in general, you need to be 18 to get a tattoo or have parents' permission. But like tattoo is definitely still signs of ownership. So depending what that tattoo says, where it is on the body, on the back of the neck, but those tattoos can also be hidden. Another thing is, does the socioeconomic status match? So, for example, you might have a girl who's from a lower middle class neighborhood wearing high end clothes. And does she have a job? Does she have parents that can afford that? Where did she get those clothes? Also, runaway and homeless youth and those involved in foster care are honestly the most at risk. So, if you're seeing girls or kids on the street, there's no such thing. It is not legal today in the United States to be quote unquote a prostitute at the age of 16 or 17. That is sex trafficking. Okay. So seeing kids on the street, homeless, like that's a huge red flag. But those are kind of some of the signs dating wise. So do you have a 14, 15, 16-year-old girl dating a much older man? Does that make sense? Do the parents know about it? Has she recently, maybe she used to be a really good student. Now she stays up all night. People don't know where she goes. You know, some of that can also be signs of depression. So I use all these are like red flags just to be aware of. There doesn't mean they're like automatically, oh my gosh, she's being trafficked, but they're red flags to be aware of. And when in doubt, say something, whether it's talking to a parent like, hey, is everything going okay? Or whether it's reporting to social workers, um, anything, law enforcement, you never know. It could open something up.
Can you speak some to what happens or what is happening legislatively in different states? Or I don't know of national legislation, but what are some good policies, maybe, and what are examples of some bad policies that have been passed that maybe are intended to help, but don't end up being helpful?
One of the older responses in years past was sometimes when there's not a trafficking specific shelter. So let's say a ring is busted and women and young women are rescued. Well, now the next question is where do we, put them? And so if that area doesn't have a trafficking specific shelter, sometimes they can go into foster care and other times they were put in juvenile delinquent centers. And that was at the time for their own safety. We call that delinquency response, um, especially if they're going to be testifying against a trafficker. They're trying to keep them safe and they had nowhere else to put them. The problem with that is that most of the time, depending on how long the girl has been in the ring or in the game, so to speak, um, the psychological manipulation that she has endured, she has, come to believe that this is okay. Many, many times they don't realize they're victims. They're going to look at you like, no, I'm doing this on my own accord because that's what's been drilled into them. And so what would end up happening is they were recruiting other girls in the jails. And in the juvenile detention centers, and they were finding ways to get out, and then it was just creating problems. Um, and then really screening your foster care people and training your foster care parents, because sometimes if we place them in foster care, they just got right back into bad situations where the girls would run away and go right back to the trafficker. So finding a way and making sure that there is funding to put them in real safe houses that are run by, always we want to be survivor informed. That means we want survivors who have been through it to help guide us on what is best. And training and helping us with training and getting the funding to have those kinds of safe houses and to have a place for women to go to. Sometimes they also use like domestic violence shelters are kind of related. And so they might use those as a place for girls to go, but that doesn't always work either. So really looking at that. Prosecution is tricky. One of the stories I talk about is if the adults that are trafficked, especially as time goes on, if they are never rescued, I call them the children we missed. But what happens is if you grow up in the trafficking ring, you eventually, as you get older and as more crimes are committed by the trafficking ring, you are going to be held accountable and prosecuted right along with the main trafficker. And so that gives us a lot of pause, right? Is that really the answer? And so that's something that legislatively is difficult it's a difficult conversation to navigate because people say, well, they still committed these crimes, but it's all they've known. If you started on the streets or you were trafficked, say at 14 and by 35, you're still again, it's called in the game. What do you expect? Where are they going to go? And so that's another issue when we're talking about prosecution, that we really look directly at those who are directly responsible and who got them into it. And we focus on that, and we look a little differently at those survivors who are unfortunately later charged as co-conspirators. So that's something that we're still kind of looking at.
That all sounds complicated and complex.
It is. And one thing I've learned in the years that I was a sex trafficking advocate, it's a gray world. There's no black and white. And it was really hard. There's no easy answers. There was no I think this idea that women are rescued, it's so easily, it's not. The damage that's done to them psychologically, the trauma that they've endured, the complex trauma that they've endured made it very difficult. And so it's from that perspective, people are like, well, wow, that's a sad, depressing story. It is. It is sad, and it should sadden us, but it's also a big deal that look how many more people are talking about it, though. And so we are building awareness, even in the 10, 15 years since, I've worked in the field, like there's been so much more awareness. So we are moving in the right direction, and we want to hold on to that hope. And we have to address the demand. We have to address the demand side. So, and until we do that, we're going to continue to battle this. But the demand side is a whole nother,
Yeah.
difficult conversation to navigate.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you tell us more about Women Deserve Better and the work that you do through Feminists for Life?
So, as with Feminists for Life, we have a Women Deserve Better campaign. And we do believe, of course, that women deserve better than abortion. That's a registered slogan. But we also created a website, and it's womendeservebetter.com. And that is the place that women can go to free of debate. So, it's not about abortion. It's not about the debate of abortion. It is literally just a website with resources and support for pregnant and parenting women and their families. It's broken down into 4 sections: work, learn, live, and love. And in each of those sections, there are articles, tips to help women who are pregnant and raising families. And it's sort of like just providing that tangible resources. Now, we are a national organization, so these are not local, these are national supportive services that we're talking about, and a lot of just articles with tips. And it's something that we would love to see more pro-life pregnancy centers sharing that resource, maybe navigating to it. If there is a national resource, we put it on there. And if it has a local component to it, we try to explain that. So it's a website that you can go to and you can share, just to say, hey, there is something. I just need a place to start. What are my rights as a college student who's pregnant? Like, most college students don't know that. It's like, well, okay, let me look that up. Maybe I didn't know that I had rights. What are my rights as a pregnant worker? What are my rights as a birth mom? Those are the kinds of things that you might just be thinking about. And so that website is designed to help out with that.
That's great. Um, we could talk about this for hours and hours. It's such a huge issue. But as we wrap up here, anything that we missed, what do you want? What should people walk away from this conversation knowing? What are the most
Well,
important things?
one of the things that we wanted to do as Feminists for Life was to reach, especially as we wrestled with the sex trafficking issue, we need to reach our girls younger, right? Both to be protected from the exploitation of abortion as well as the exploitation of their bodies via sex trafficking. And so we created the You Are Forever Priceless campaign. And with that, it's our Girls Deserve Better project. And we created an account on Instagram. And so I encourage everybody to check out Girls Deserve Better on Instagram to help girls start navigating those things. It's important to know by the time you're 10, 11, 9, that you are forever priceless, and that you can start believing those things so that you're not falling prey to this over sexualization, which, as you and I know, can lead to the exploitation of abortion. And so our Girls Deserve Better project is sort of like the newest thing we've been doing as Feminists for Life. And so I encourage, people to check that out. Definitely share Women Deserve Better, and then look up Feminists for Life and the pro-life feminist history. Sarah Foster, our president, of course, did the Talk the Feminist case against abortion. And so I think and then ultimately I want to leave people with what I shared in my story, is that just remember there's as much of you inside this child as there was, the rapist. And so mothers matter, right? Our maternity matters. The maternity of a child matters. And when we're talking about cases of rape, we don't have to keep on saying the rapist baby. what would happen if we culturally shifted to the mother's child? You know, how would that change what you talk about?
I love that. Joyce, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks,
I think
Joyce.
this is really great.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks
If
for
you guys
having
are
me.
listening and want to find out more, go find Feminists for Life. They're all over the internet on social media, X, Facebook, Instagram, their website. Check out what they're doing. They have really great videos on YouTube you can check out. But Joyce, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Dear Jane. Don't forget to subscribe. Of course, you can find us on all your podcast platforms of choice. Don't forget to follow us on X and Instagram. On behalf of Marcy Little, I'm Scott Baker. Thanks for listening.